So the image that we are looking at right now is a depiction of the northern hemisphere of the Americas, and an illustration of obviously it's a two-dimensional illustration of planet Earth, and the lines on this drawing describe trajectories from which the annular solar eclipse of February 12th, 1831 can be viewed. And the reason that we're beginning with this image is because this particular view of the moon, an annular eclipse is an eclipse in which the moon appears, in front of the sun, but doesn't entirely eclipse or block the view of that solar body, so that an annular ring is that area between two concentric circles, between the smaller concentric circle and a larger concentric circle, so that the sun appears as a ring with a darkened center. And the reason that we're looking at this image of those areas and the changing perspectives from which this solar phenomenon or this planetary solar phenomenon can be regarded, is because it relates to the theme of our space-time synchrony themes in connection to Black History Month, because it was taken as a sign, a celestial sign, by Nat Turner on February 12th, 1831, when he viewed this phenomenon from Virginia, and he regarded this sign as a sign that it was a time to revolt. And it is said that Turner, regarded the sign as if it were the hand of an African American slave reaching up to the sun. And I want to relate the deployment of the celestial phenomenon in Turner's mind and hands, and actions to a number of issues, a number of what will appear to be disparate, issues, but that to me, somehow, in one way or another, seem to relate, in at least insofar as themes are concerned, and what the motivation for actions are, and how they form our self-understandings, and the way that we work, and the way that we regard ourselves. And I want to relate this particular moment to Joe Rogan's recent criticism for his use of the N-word, and his his insistence that his use of this word, because of its context, is not an example of racist language, and his failure to understand his participation in these various discourses, and his deployment of this extraordinarily racist description of he and his friends viewing a movie, and I won't even really get there yet. If I get there at all, I'm gonna it won't be in passing, but leave it to say, how a defense for what is obviously like a series of acts of racism. The defense itself like deploys a story and narrative that is like so extraordinarily offensively racist that how anyone could not see it as such is somewhat remarkable. Okay, so I want to get to that, and I want to get to it via William Styron's 1967 publication of a novel called The Confessions of Nat Turner, that in a certain way similarly utilizes racial stereotypes and racially stereotypical tropes, and that come from the white male racial imagination. So in the history of racial injustice in the United States, the excuse for lynching a black man was often that he had either looked at in some sexually offensive way or raped, or always the implication was this potential stealing of the white woman in one way or another from the white man. And in Styron's novel, this plays out in various ways, and so this racial fantasy of the white male unconscious becomes the one of the driving forces behind the construction of the novel, so that the events and the characters are formulated around these psychological impulses that are driven by this kind of racialized imagination, as opposed to say a sign from the heavens, and I want to get there, but it's a complicated process, and I want to get there with Rogan too, because in many ways, his story about viewing this film is very much like the way that Styron constructs the tale of Nat Turner. It's driven by the machinations of racial stereotypes within this white imaginary, particularly like patriarchal white imaginary, in which the stealing of white women is of central concern, and and that was one of the unspoken reasons why a publication of 10 African American writers spoke out against the novel. I believe it was in 1968, but I have to do that research. I'm starting 2 days early on this project because it's going to take a lot of time, and because my internet service requires that I spend a long time waiting for things to go up. So it's only February 10th today, but we're starting this project, and I had envisioned it, beginning May 12th anyway. But so I wanted to talk about like what a difference it makes, to imagine, in somewhat like the way that this project works, beginning with external phenomenon or convergences of external phenomenon, dates and times and histories, and even celestial phenomenon in the case of Nat Turner. Now, one could say, well, it falls within this sort of mythopoeic, epistemology, because he's reading it as a sign from the heavens, and relates to astrology in that way and other things. And one could say that that's true, but it's not really astrology so much as it's astronomy. This was a phenomenon, right? And I want to get there, but it's going to take a lot of work and deep thinking to do so. But I want to argue that things that begin with the materials, however much we don't believe them, to be prejudiced or racialized or whatever, of the unconscious that emerge into our work, from, as I'm referring to the racialized white imaginary, beginning with that, like writing a novel out of these racial stereotypes, or telling stories that justify your use of the N-word, that begin with these sort of unconscious motivations and prejudices, is very different than beginning with the idea of a physical and historical convergence. And we're moving there, but it'll take a while. In response to the William Styron novel, well, let's talk about that a bit. One of my teachers when I was at UCSD in the early 80s was Shirley Ann Williams. And Shirley Ann Williams passed away in July 1999. I think it was July 6, 1999. She'd been struggling with cancer, and she'd received a diagnosis of that cancer earlier that year in February. And I don't know the date of which, in February, which she received the diagnosis and the diagnosis and knowledge, of the course of that illness. But I do recall that it was in February. And I wasn't in San Diego at that time. I was in New York, and I was working on another piece. I was working on the first. I was actually in preparation for the inception of the first act, or the first scene in the first act of a piece that I was working on, that I referred to as acts. And I was unaware, at that time, that she had left us. And but I was aware of her work, both her poetry and its relationship to gospel music and the blues and jazz poetry and narratives of her own life experience and the kind of destitution of lack of resources that she grew up with, and she was from she's from the same place that I was from. She was she's born in Fresno, and I was from Fresno as well initially, and we had that experience in common as well. So I think she was born in Fresno. Maybe she just grew up in Fresno. I'm not entirely certain about that, but I'll check the page and see. But although she she didn't write directly on Nat Turner, I know that that she was aware of William Styron's novel and how problematic it was, and this novel of his was purchased, and it was going to turn into a Hollywood film. The Black Anti-Defamation League, with sort of, headed by Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, had some influence on arguing that minimally, the actors and the cast, for this production, should be chosen, by African Americans, who have some stake in this narrative, to begin with. That was, in many ways, the feeling was that it was stolen, and profit was being made on this stolen story that was so important to the African American community and so important to Black history, and hence so relevant to Black History Month, right? So it was one of these cultural appropriations where not only a white man had taken the narrative, rewritten it in terms of this like racially, stereotypical cultural imagination, with all of these, sexualized fantasies and rape fantasies on the part of, Turner and other characters within the story, and then Hollywood, white Hollywood had gotten a hold of it, and all these considerations were, being made. Well, eventually, it never. I don't believe it turned into a film because I think Hollywood dropped it after the controversy. But there was, reason for the controversy, and I was aware that when I was working with Shirley, that that it was these kinds of histories and literary histories were part of what she taught, and I took a number of courses with her, including courses on the blues and its relationship to African American history, and jazz as well, and gospel, and themes, right, like we're dealing with here, but themes on African American manhood in the African American novel, and African American womanhood in the African American novel, and her orchestration of these themes was always well rehearsed and well researched, and so Styron and William Styron and his publication of the Confessions of Nat Turner weren't something that we ever really turned to, but as to look at as a foci of investigation, but it was always there in the background, and it certainly was in the background of her own work. And when she published and did the research for Desarose, her great African American novel, and one of the, in my mind, greatest African American novels, and the most neglected and overlooked African American novel that I can think of, and I say that unqualifiedly, not that may be the most neglected. I would just say that it is the most neglected great African American novel, Desarose, and I remember, when she discusses the research for that book, she discusses it in these terms of convergence. She said, in the historical period, in which I was writing, there was a Black woman who defied her slave masters and made attempts to escape the institution of slavery, and there was this white woman who challenged both the norms of patriarchy and the institutions of slavery, and she said, and I imagined that they met, and so imagining they met is a kind of convergence that is a fiction, but so is Turner's interpretation of this celestial phenomenon. But I want to get to the point where I argue that it begins with a very different kind of looking and imagining of convergences than, drawing up materials from the unconscious to fill in the story. And I want to, to in some way align, the strategies of a racist cultural, a popular cultural icon like Joe Rogan, and the racial motivations behind William Styron's, construction of the narrative of Nat Turner. And I want to talk about also, like economics. I want to talk about the way that appropriating these materials and making money on them is problematic. And it's even more problematic when they're distorted in these racially biased ways. And I want to talk about the way that you could say, well, even African Americans, some, like I think it was James Baldwin and I can't remember who else, but defended Styron's construction of this narrative, and it sounds okay in a way, while he what historical right does anyone have to a story, but the problem is this, he was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, received the Pulitzer Prize for this novel. What about all of those other great African American novels whose stories belong to African Americans who didn't receive Pulitzer Prizes? You know what I mean? And Shirley Ann Williams was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for Deaths of Rose, but she didn't receive it. But why not? I mean, in my mind, it's so much better and so much better researched and relevant. Than the Styron, but the answer is obvious. So not only can Joe Rogan use the N-word, and not get censored, but he can make money on using it, right? And this is something that, however wrong Whoopi Goldberg was in her obvious misinterpretation of Nazi Germany as not racially motivated, which it was like the oppressions, particularly suffered by European Jews and European Gypsies in under the Nazis and under their programmatic genocides were entirely formulated in racial terms, right? So however wrong, she was, she was censored, and however wrong she was, I think the question of whether she's making money on her misinterpretation of the Holocaust, should enter into the equation, because Joe Rogan is clearly making money, right, on his racist stories and his racist use of the N-word, right? That's why, for me, it becomes problematic, right? So I appropriate all kinds of Native American imagery and imagery from cultures that, as a genetic subject I don't belong to, but I don't make money on it. I use it for political art, to promote a cause, and I think the difference is relevant, and in any case, without getting into too much of that, and before proceeding any further, I think I've laid out the groundwork for some of the ways that I want to explore this moment of this map and this particular date, February 12th, 1831, within the next couple of days as February 12th approaches, and perhaps beyond. But to drive this point about, whether, racial stereotypes are enough to censor, doesn't Styron have the right, to write this novel, and what does it do? What is the appropriation of an African American historical voice by a white man? What does that do, and what does it say? In Shirley Ann Williams' novel, in Censorship, she also speaks, in addition, to speaking from the point of view of Dessa, the African American slave woman protagonist of the story, or one could argue, part of the story's trajectory of central characters. These other voices as well that include, voices very well represented, meaning very well constructed from a historical point of view in terms of the language and dialect structures, of this white woman and a white, slave owner as well. So what is the difference when a subject from a community of historically oppressed people, appropriates a voice, versus when a subject from a community of, historically oppressive individuals appropriates the voice of an actual historically oppressed, figure like Nat Turner. So I don't know how much we'll be able to do, but those are issues that I want to address. But I want to move away from this figure of the globe for just a second, because I want to really begin with an emotional response to this information in this article. And I just found this online today because I looked up Shirley Ann Williams, and this, I don't know this author, but the author of this piece is, and I'll probably mispronounce this name, and my apologies for doing so, Janchup Felgyal? I don't know. Felgyal? I really don't know, and my apologies for the mispronunciation. But the publication date is April 13th, 2000. So that is approximately perhaps 9 months after Shirley Ann left us. And this is an image of Shirley Ann and her son. This is Malcolm. We'll probably want to say we will probably want to say more about this image later and how it embodies or manifests so much of who Shirley Ann was, and and what went into her work as a writer and a teacher, and the biggest part of that is obviously love, right? And so those classes that she taught about African American manhood and its construction in literature, and you know, particularly African American literature, but also, you know, that related to constructions of manhood and in novels like William Styron's, you know, The Confessions of Nat Turner, published in 1967, right? Just a few years before the birth of Malcolm. Now, Shirley Ann was very much aware, you know, how these novels contributed, you know, to images of Black young men and Black adult men, you know, and how they contributed to the life and world and psychological context in which her son, you know, would grow and did grow up, and so these were the stakes of these were the stakes of that context of writing and doing, you know, the historical research and of teaching, and these were the stakes involved in choosing those themes, right? And so this image of Shirley Ann, you know, holding her son, do relate, you know, to the construction of manhood offered in a novel like William Styron's, and in the construction of manhood that is being projected and promoted by the racialized bravado of someone, you know, like Joe Rogan today. And you know, I don't have one readily available, but if you could compare this image of the loving and caring and comforting and protective mother, you know, with any image, random image, just do a Google search of Joe Rogan and see what you get, right? You will understand, you know, what those stakes are. And she didn't work, you know, out of this is what she worked out of. This is her heart. She didn't, and if she made money, and if economy was involved, it was to provide, you know, for her family, and it was to provide, you know, a home, and it wasn't to capitalize and exploit, you know, the potentialities of the literary market, you know, for profit and gain. But I want to begin with, you know, looking at this theme from the point of view of you know, economic context, and in this article, here's another, you know, beautiful picture of Shirley. I think this might have been from no, it's 1981. I was going to say earlier. Okay, so this is where I really wanted to begin. I just found this article today, and this is the author, you know, that I had read her name, probably pronounced it incorrectly, but and this is only 9 months after her death, and the book that she's referring to here is Desarose. Okay, so when I heard of her death, I went in search of a copy of the book, Desarose, presumably, whose paperback rights had been sold 13 years before for $100,000, and whose film rights were secured by Irwin Winkler, a film veteran with 10 Oscars to his credit. Yeah, I don't really think that Irwin Winkler would be the best either director or producer of Censorship, but and I know that I know this history, and I know that the film was never made; it was dropped, and the rationale was probably like the rationale for failing to put back in print Shirley's poetry and novels. It hadn't become in quotes popular. But why is it that we can continue to buy copies? We can continue to buy copies of William Styron's novel, whose novel won the Pulitzer Prize, and is I've never read it, and so I don't truly know, but I know the history of it enough to know that I don't want to read it, right? And I have read Censorship, and it's really, really good. So the fact that 9 months after Shirley's death, it wasn't available in print is a crime, right? and it's not technically an act of censorship, but effectively it is, right? How can this novel not be available, but we still have to see, and you don't have any choice about it, having to see Joe Rogan. His ugly face is there every day on your YouTube page, no matter how much you don't want it there, just because of the lowest common denominator factor in the way that information is disseminated on the internet, right? And you can click as much as you want. You can click, do not show me this page again. Do not show me, but he still shows up, right? And yet, a work of love made from this great writer wasn't available 9 months after she passed. When I first heard of her death, I went in search of a copy of the book whose paperback rights had been sold 13 years before for $100,000, and whose film rights were secured by Irwin Winkler, a film veteran with 10 Oscars to his credit. The movie, however, was never made, and when I looked not only for her novel, but also her book of literary criticism, Give Birth to Brightness, and her 2 books of poetry, they were all out of print. And how is that? How is that 9 months, or presumably something like 9 months after Shirley left us, that her great works and her life was no longer available in print, and I want to begin with that, and then I want to begin with the final statement in this article, or close to the final statement in this article, as a point of departure for our synchrony theme for February 12th, and viewing this annular solar eclipse as a sign that it was time for revolt by Nat Turner. And you'll recall I'm using the theme of both the history of the appropriation of Nat Turner's story to get us here, and I'm also using the theme of how we construct a story, whether we do so out of our unconscious and whatever lurks there, our fears and prejudices, and or whether we find some other way of working that may or may not relate to the significance of our chosen histories themselves. But I wanted to also conclude the beginning of the discussion, with this. On August 8, 1999, so that was just about a month after Shirley passed. Oh yeah, more than 1 month after she died. The San Diego Union Tribune Sunday book section ran a short memorial announcement of Shirley's death. This time, the Union Tribune included a photo. And Shirley was really, she was beautiful both, inside and out, and had a fantastic smile. So you would want to include a photo of Shirley Ann Williams. Because, her expression said so much about who she was, and you could tell by her eyes and by her quiet and her gentleness that life mattered to her, and community mattered to her, and history mattered to her, and she could radiate that. Included a photo. 2 days after the tribute ran, the paper offered an apology. The announcement had been accompanied by a photo of late Shirley Day Williams, founding director of African American Museum of Fine Arts. Day Williams had died in October 1996. So 3 years earlier. And I guess that in some ways relates to certain kinds of conjunctions and coordinations and set theory work that we've been doing around with transpositions of 6 and 9 in a way as well. And some of that has been humorous, but I don't find this transposition humorous at all, because what it tells us is that that the San Diego Union Tribune put this in their paper because they understood that it was relevant, but they didn't know. They didn't know who she was. They confused her with another significant African American, woman, no doubt, but the stake and the commitment and the care, wasn't there as they are in this particular article, and that's one of the reasons why I liked reading this particular article so much. And the concluding poem, old and in pain and bearing up and hurt and age, these are the signs of our womanhood. But I'll make book Bessie did more than just endure. Hear it? So, to be able to read life as signs, the way that Nat Turner reads the annular eclipse as a sign, and here the subject, the female subject of the poem is reading in the signs of aging the bearing up and the hurt. And the history and the care and the concern and the love. To be able to read in that, in the signs of experience, material experience of the world, these histories and these dramas and these processes and journeys of the soul is a kind of gift, and it's very different from other kinds of gifts that may or may not contribute to one's literary or other artistic works, but that You certainly see it in Langston Hughes, who we began, the series of time synchrony themes with, and I'll end here in the hearing of it, the seeing of it, and the remembering